bias binding is the best invention in dressmaking. It can be used both functionally and decoratively. In a bound seam application, the seam allowance raw edges are basically encased in a folded binding. You can buy pre-packaged, pre-folded binding at your local fabric store or make it at home by cutting fabric strips on the bias and pre-folding them yourself. A bound seam finish is a bit more costly and time-consuming as it requires the application of a separate bias binding. Each seam allowance edge, or both edges if needed, is enclosed by a double folded binding strip which is usually top-stitched along its folded edges. For the purpose of finishing seam allowance edges, double fold binding is the best choice. Double fold bias binding is a strip of fabric that is cut on the bias or diagonally in relation to the fabric salvage edge, then folded lengthwise 3 times to enclose its raw edges. If you take a closer look at your packaged double fold binding, you will notice that one of the folded layers is a little wider than the other. This is done intentionally in order to facilitate the stitching process and minimize errors. Place the folded binding around the seam allowance edge such that the shorter binding layer corresponds to the top facing you while the longer one is aligned underneath. The bias binding center fold should align with the fabric edge, and all raw edges should be enclosed within the double fold binding. Depending on the fabric, binding can shift around during the machine stitching process. Regular pins will work, but if you are a sewing beginner, hand basting is the best way to accomplish a more secure, accurate alignment. Once the binding is securely hand-basted, machine stitch through all layers of the binding and fabric edge in between, applying the stitch right next to the binding's folded edge as shown. Keeping the shorter binding layer on top during the stitching process will ensure that the stitch catches the longer binding layer underneath, which is not visible while machine stitching. Using a seam ripper, remove the temporary hand-basting stitches at this point. If the binding is difficult to align in fully folded position, you could attach it to the fabric edge by unfolding it and using the crease lines as a stitching guide. This method provides a bit more stability and is often preferred by sewing beginners. Unfold the binding, but do not iron it open. Align one of the binding edges to the garment seam allowance edge such that the face sides of both layers are touching. Insert pins horizontally through both fabric layers as you would when pinning a regular seam. Stitch them together with the binding facing up. Follow the closest binding crease as a guide. Once the binding is connected to the seam allowance edge, allow it to naturally fold in place and enclose all raw edges. Insert pins or hand baste through the binding and fabric to keep all layers in place during the final stitching process. Top slip stitch through all layers of the binding and fabric next to the open folded edge of the binding as shown. Last but not least, remove the hand basting using a seam ripper and iron the final binding application for a smooth, flat finish.